Welcome to NarrativeNook audio tales where enchanted stories come to life. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe, like and share to support our channel. Enjoy listening. What else if not because of your lousy presentation? But he did not say it out loud, and Luke ignored him. As Sebastian walked toward Nicole, he looked on, and his suspicion was finally confirmed. I did not expect that the naive-looking Riddle family could secretly build such a relationship with Sebastian to the point where even Sebastian's own son could do nothing about it. Taylor was also stupefied as he saw Sebastian and Nicole standing together and talking so happily with each other. He did not know that Nicole knew Sebastian earlier. Mr. Riddle Sr. stood to the side, looking at the attitude of the people around him toward Nicole, and clearly felt something strange. Why are these people looking for Nicole when they are supposed to come to meet me? Could it be that those people who came yesterday were actually because for Nicole? Seeing Nicole chatting with a group of businessmen, Mr. Riddle Sr. had a complicated look in his eyes. Even Damien and Dexter looked at Nicole in amazement and disbelief. They had invited Sebastian multiple times, but this was the first time Sebastian had come to the Riddle mansion. And when Sebastian came in, he was friendly to them. Damien and Dexter had never enjoyed such treatment from him. They looked at Sebastian, stupefied, as Sebastian greeted them with a smile. Seeing their non-reaction, Mr. Riddle Sr. glared at them and chided them. "What are you doing? Don't be so rude." Damien and Dexter came to their senses at once, looked at Sebastian, and greeted him back. Just that they still felt surreal. Chloe also saw Sebastian. She held her skirt and quickly came over, as she could not wait to talk to Sebastian. Sebastian looked at Nicole, who was by Mr. Riddle Sr.'s side, with a smile, and then came up to her. "How was your monthly exam?" he asked. Nicole looked at him and replied casually, "Not bad." Everyone watched with their mouths agape as Nicole chatted with Sebastian. I can't believe that Nicole can talk so naturally to Mr. Wyance, and Mr. Wyance cares so much about her grades. It's incredible. Sean and Steve had noticed what was going on, and that seemed to confirm their suspicion. They did not expect that the person in the Riddle family who knew Sebastian would turn out to be their sister. Daniel might have known that Sebastian knew his daughter, but he did not expect them to be so close. Chloe watched what happened with surprise and jealousy. She also did not expect Nicole and Sebastian knew each other. The thought of Lloyd and Jared's attitude toward Nicole yesterday came to mind. She is obviously just a yokel. How the hell did she get to know these people? Her face contorted with envy at the thought of this. Snow, who stood beside Chloe, said in a whisper, "Is that guy who is talking to Nicole someone important? It seems that people's attitude toward him is unusual." Chloe could not care less about this cousin of hers, who did not even know who Sebastian was. She looked coldly in Nicole's direction and stood in place. Since Nicole was getting all the attention now, she would not go over and make herself miserable. But when she casually looked around, she spotted someone she never expected to see here. Mr. Riddle Sr. was clinking glasses with the guests. Since he had just recovered from his illness, he could only drink tea in place of wine, but this did not affect his enjoyment. Now, he was no longer worried her granddaughter would be bullied as she could now stand on her own feet. While he was talking to someone from one of the major families in San Joto, he heard an insidious voice that he recognized coming from behind him. "Hello, Benjamin. Congratulations on your good fortune." Damien and Dexter also heard the voice and recognized it at once. They frowned when they saw Christo walk on crutches toward them. Christo seemed to have aged 10 years overnight, looking like a dying man. His eyes were grim and unnerving to look at. Mr. Riddle Sr. looked surprised at Christo, but he quickly regained his composure. "What are you doing here? We didn't invite you, please leave." Christo looked at Mr. Riddle Sr. and snickered with resentment. "Can't I come to see my old friend?" Meanwhile, there was a trace of displeasure in her eyes as Nicole looked at Sean standing behind Christo silently. Everyone saw what happened in front of their eyes and silence suddenly fell on the noisy party. Even though the Rogers family had fallen out of being the first-class family, they were still influential to some extent. Nicole looked cool, calm, and collected. Everyone looked at her as they all knew how the Rogers family collapsed so quickly. It was said that the Rogers family had done something unfavorable to Nicole, and that infuriated Jared, who immediately imposed a brutal sanction against them. No one knew better than Christo what was going on in between. When he saw that Mr. Riddle Sr. remained silent, he turned to look at Nicole with a sneer. "I didn't even know that Nicole possessed such marvelous abilities. So I would like to ask, since you didn't want to help me, why did you give me the life-saving drug in the first place?" Nicole looked at him with no change in her expression. "The drug I gave you was good enough to make you feel better, and you only needed ordinary dialysis treatment to extend your life," Nicole said calmly, her eyes frosty, and she did not seem to take offense at his hostile attitude. "It was you who were suspicious of me, refusing to take the prescribed dosage. Not only that, you wanted to catch me and even threatened me with my family." At this point, a frosty look appeared in Nicole's eyes. "Now tell me, should I save someone like you?" Christo's face instantly turned pale upon hearing what Nicole had said. But he quickly calmed down and sneered. "How do I know if you are lying to me? I'm here today for a final showdown with you. If you refuse to give me the drug, I will make you regret it." Nicole glanced at the hand gesture of the men from the Johnston family in the shadows, and then looked at Christo with mockery in her eyes. She said not a word, as if waiting to see how Christo could not make her regret it. Thinking that Nicole had been intimidated, Christo looked at her triumphantly. "I knew Nicole had lied. She couldn't have been so kind to give me the drug." After years of burgeoning, Christo thought he could still put the Riddle family in its place even if he was not as powerful as before. Sebastian watched in silence and understood what was really going on. He looked at Christo, who still did not see him but talked to himself, as if he had been immersed in his own world. Sebastian frowned. Just as he was about to say something to Christo, the door of the Riddle mansion suddenly opened and a cold and forceful voice came. "Christo, you've never changed, have you?" Christo shivered subconsciously upon hearing the voice. He immediately turned around and almost fainted when he saw Maximilian walk toward him. Everyone else looked at the old man with surprise. They did not expect to see someone from the Johnston family at the Riddle family's party. Many of them were not worried because they had made no mistake. "We've made the right decision to come here, especially with the presence of the patriarch of the Johnston family in the Riddle family's party." Maximilian looked at Christo with a grim face. But Christo's face looked even grimmer, and he was under pressure when he saw Maximilian. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Johnston Sr. sneered, handed the invitation card to a server, and then looked at Christo coldly. "What am I doing here? I'm invited here, unlike someone who has come unsolicited." He did not spare another glance at Christo and went up to talk to Mr. Riddle Sr., as if they were close to each other. Many people looked at what happened and suddenly remembered what they had heard many years ago. It was rumored that the Riddle and the Johnston families had a close relationship. Now it seemed to be true. People's attitude toward the Riddle family changed all of a sudden. Everyone was thankful that they had made the right choice to come. Many families did not come to the party because they did not want to be seen lowering themselves to mingle with the Riddle family. Many of them who came wondered how those who had chosen not to come would feel when they learned that Sebastian and Mr. Johnston Sr. were also here. While Mr. Johnston Sr. was talking to Mr. Riddle Sr., his eyes lit up with surprise when he saw Nicole was there. "Are you Nicole?" he asked. Nicole looked at the old man and could feel his friendliness. So she nodded and said hello. Maximilian finally met Nicole in person. He looked at her with interest. Just then, a familiar voice came from the side. "Mr. Johnston Sr., it's been a long time since we last met." Maximilian turned his head and was surprised to see Sebastian in casual wear standing next to Nicole. He was too focused on Nicole and had not noticed Sebastian. "Sebastian is also here." Mr. Johnston Sr. was startled for a second. He then looked at Sebastian and let out a meaningful smile. "It seems that my grandson's worries are unfounded." With Sebastian here, and even if he did not come, the Rogers family could still not bully the Riddle family easily. Sebastian let out a smile. Mr. Riddle Sr. thought for a second and immediately knew what was on the Johnston family's mind. Mr. Johnston Sr. had stayed a low profile all this while. "I'm afraid he has come to the party to help the Riddle family, and we have such an honor, all because of Nicole." Mr. Riddle Sr. looked proud at the thought of this. They sat together and enjoyed talking with each other. Mr. Johnston Sr. was curious about Nicole and asked many questions, and Nicole answered all of them. She maintained a straight face, sitting with her back straight, looking extremely graceful in the face of such a powerful person. On the other hand, Damien found no opportunity to interject. Everyone else looked at Nicole, who was surrounded in the middle, with a complicated look in their eyes. At first, he looked down upon Nicole, but now her achievement was even higher than his. He figured he probably would not be able to do this if he were Nicole. Daniel and Gloria stood to the side, watching their daughter become the center of attention in front of those bigwigs, and felt proud of her. Nicole looked at Sean and Steve and then said to Mr. Riddle Sr., "Grandpa, it's my brother's party today, so I won't stay much longer. I will go upstairs first." Maximilian looked at Nicole with even more appreciation in her eyes upon hearing what she said. She knew her place, even though she was now in the spotlight. Sebastian seemed to have expected that Nicole would say this. He looked at her and nodded. Mr. Riddle Sr. looked at Nicole with surprise, but he quickly realized something and smiled. "Go ahead." Chloe and Snow watched with jealousy as all three of them loved Nicole. Nicole really knows how to use the 1 step backward and 2 steps forward technique. The two of them came over, hoping to be noticed by Sebastian and Mr. Johnston Sr., but when Maximilian turned his head, he was actually nodding at Sean and Steve, and then squinted at Christo. "Aren't you leaving yet?" Glancing at Christo, who looked at Nicole with an indignant look in the eyes, he walked over, grabbed Christo's collar, and dragged him out of the door. He did not forget the things that his grandson had entrusted him with. Christo was frail and dragged along by the strong Maximilian, as if a mother cat carried her baby. As he tried to resist desperately, Sean looked on anxiously, but was doing nothing. Not that he did not want to. It was just that no one dared to defy Maximilian. No one had the desire to intervene. Everyone just looked on, dumbfounded, as Maximilian hauled Christo out of the party venue. It seems that the Rogers family is really collapsing. Chloe and Snow were stunned at seeing what happened before their eyes. Especially Chloe, who was still thinking of marrying into the Rogers family, never expected them to be so inept in front of Maximilian. She was extremely jealous at the thought of how nicely Maximilian treated Nicole just now. What is so good about Nicole that Jared likes her so much and even asks his grandfather to protect her? Why can't she if Nicole can? She gathered herself and put up a smile at Maximilian, who was walking past her. "Hello, Mr. Johnston Sr., I'm Dash." Maximilian shot an impatient glance at the woman who was blocking his way. "Get out of the way. Didn't you see that I'm in a hurry? This little girl really doesn't know any better." Chloe was embarrassed and quickly stepped aside after being reprimanded harshly. Behind her, Snow watched her being reprimanded and breathed a soft sigh of relief. "Fortunately, Chloe is ahead of me. Otherwise, I would have been the one facing this embarrassing situation." She patted herself on the chest, glad that she was not the one being reprimanded. But the thought of Mr. Johnston Sr.'s attitude toward Nicole and Mr. Ellison's disregard for her frustrated her. "There will always be a chance to fix Nicole," she said in her mind. Thinking of this, she just remembered that, although Mr. Johnston Sr. was gone, Sebastian was still here. She hurried over to say hello to Sebastian. Her grandfather had ordered her father not to come out and enjoined her to build rapport with Sebastian. Snow walked toward Sebastian when she heard Sebastian say to Mr. Riddle Sr., "This time the Riddle family has done really well." Sebastian looked at the two young men in front of him and turned to look approvingly at Mr. Riddle Sr. With the help of such young men, the Riddle family will only get stronger and stronger. Mr. Riddle Sr. nodded gratefully. "Thank you for your compliment, Mr. Wyants." Sebastian said a few more words of encouragement to Sean and Steve, nodded to Damien and Dexter, and then slowly walked out. Snow had waited for a long time without even having a chance to talk to Sebastian even until he left. People followed Sebastian and greeted him as he went. He was different from Maximilian. He had always been gentler and approachable, and people were seeing him out, while when Maximilian left, no one except Chloe dared to stand in his way. Snow looked at Sebastian, who was surrounded by people, and stomped her feet, feeling frustrated as she did not even get a chance to get close to Sebastian. No one spared a glance at Snow, who was left upset by herself, as people swarmed around Sebastian to see him out. Taylor was witnessing the entire episode. Not wanting to be left behind, he gritted his teeth and followed. Sebastian walked out slowly, appearing steady when looking from behind him. It was not hard to imagine that he lived a life like this every day. Snow and Chloe almost fainted in anger as they missed yet another opportunity. After today's party, everyone would know Nicole from the Riddle family for her relationship with not only Sebastian but also Maximilian. And I get nothing. Snow and Chloe thought to themselves each. After Sebastian left, Damien looked a little stupefied to see people start to come up to him and compliment him. They were the very same people who did not bother to look at him previously. But thanks to Nicole, they all were now smiling fawningly at him. Mr. Riddle Sr. looked at Sean and Steve and was pleased with them. Gaining Sebastian's approval meant more and more people would recognize their abilities. Maybe it's really time to delegate more responsibilities to the young people. Thinking of this, Mr. Riddle Sr. quietly made a decision. Nicole returned to the room, put her bag down, turned around, and knocked on the door of the guest room next door. Carl. There was no answer. Probably he was not there. Nicole thought of Carl's restless personality and shook her head helplessly. The party downstairs did not seem to have ended. Probably some more guests had arrived as there was another uproar again. Nicole returned to her room, took out the silver white shard again, and carefully studied it in the palm of her hand. At this level of damage, she could almost be sure that it had been hit by an extreme impact force. Ordinary weapons could not have shattered it. It had to be some heavy weapon, and to do this, the person needed to understand the weaknesses of this alloy. As the hardest metal in the world, it was impossible to break so easily. Nicole clutched the chrome-nickel alloy in her hand and squinted her eyes. She saw this rampant act as a direct challenge to her redline. Suddenly, there were light footsteps coming from behind her. Nicole looked back and was surprised to see Carl and Preston, both dressed in formal suits, talking to each other while walking upstairs. Nicole looked at the two with surprise. As far as she knew, they were the typical type of guys who disliked wearing suits. Preston and Carl now saw Nicole. Preston quickened his steps up the stairs and came up to Nicole with a sly smile. "Your friend is interesting." Nicole looked at him and cocked an eyebrow. "Won't you go downstairs?" The party should not be over yet, and he could fit in perfectly with the occasion in this attire. But Preston waved his dismissing hand at hearing about the party. He loosened his tie and solemnly said, "Only the latest motorcycle exhibition and visiting your grand is worth my suit." Nicole looked at his prudish look and smiled. Carl had also walked up behind Preston, looked at Nicole, and blinked. "Your house seems to be vivacious today." Nicole nodded and looked at Preston, who quickly realized something and gestured at Carl before going downstairs. Nicole then looked at Carl with a serious face. "Pack up. We'll leave tonight," she said in a somewhat impersonal voice. The playful look faded from Carl's eyes. He quickly stepped aside and pulled out his mobile phone to make a call. His black phone was exactly the same as Nicole's. Nicole watched him walk into the room and take out his things. The habits of the two were almost indistinguishable, both lightly armed, and each person carried only a simple travel bag. He threw the bag over his shoulder and turned to leave with Nicole. "Wait a minute," Nicole suddenly said. Carl looked at Nicole with puzzlement, not knowing why she called a halt. "We will go to another place first," she said, walking out with her bag on her back. The two of them quietly left through the back door. An hour later, in Great Oak, Mrs. Wallace Sr. opened the door and was surprised to see Nicole standing outside. "Nicole? It's late at night now. What are you doing here?" Nicole looked at her grandmother and whispered, "The boy who treated you rudely in the classroom last time asked me to convey his apology to you." Mrs. Wallace Sr. nodded, not minding it. Instead, she looked at her granddaughter with puzzlement. "Where are you going?" Nicole knew she could never hide things from her grandmother, nor did she intend to. "I am traveling with my parents, worried that you would miss me, so I first came to see you." Mrs. Wallace Sr. nodded. "Don't worry about me. I'm all right. Be careful when you're out there." Nicole listened patiently to her grandmother's nagging admonition without interrupting her. After a moment, she glanced at her watch. "Grandma, I have to go." Mrs. Wallace Sr. nodded downheartedly and sighed softly as she watched her granddaughter turn away. Nicole had always been sensible. Especially after she was lost and found, she became as steady and dependable as now. Every time before going out, she would let her grandmother know lest her grandmother would be worried. Mrs. Wallace Sr. knew that her granddaughter had secrets, and that she probably was not going on a vacation. But since Nicole did not tell her, she would not ask. Returning to her room silently, Mrs. Wallace Sr. sat down at her desk, secretly praying for Nicole's safe return. What had to be done had been done. Nicole and Carl headed straight for the airport. On the plane, Nicole silently looked at the clouds outside the window, her mind drifting away. She thought of where she was about to return and sighed. Carl noticed her emotions and turned to look at her with a slight concern in his affectionate blue eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked. Nicole said not a word. She shook her head gently and closed her eyes. Carl looked at her for a moment and then pulled a blanket over her body. He did not want Nicole to continue to get involved in those things, but she was the only person who could control those things and solve the crisis. The plane seemed to be flying in an arc across the sky. When it landed, the sun was shining brightly, and the air was warm. In San Giotto, when Sebastian returned home, he kneaded his forehead as he felt a little exhausted after going out for the entire day. A sound came from the kitchen. At first, Sebastian thought Marie was back in his house and cooking without him asking. But before he could say anything, Martin poked his head out of the kitchen. "Dad? You're back." Sebastian nodded, looking at Martin with surprise and a faint sense of puzzlement. "What are you doing in the kitchen?" Martin shrugged. "I'm hungry, and thinking that you must haven't eaten, so I have also made you something." He then brought 3 dishes straight out. Sebastian looked at them and was surprised. "These things look good." He looked at his son and asked, "When did you learn to cook?" Martin replied impatiently while setting the table. "When I was still a child, you were always not at home. So I learned a little by myself, and then when I went abroad, I was not used to the food there and learned to cook." Sebastian felt a faint pang of guilt upon hearing what Martin said. Martin seemed to have read his mind and cocked an eyebrow. "Don't get sentimental now, it's too late." Then he sat down at the table and dug in. "Where have you been this evening?" he suddenly asked casually. Sebastian took off his coat, and after washing his hands, he sat down and said, "The Riddle family had a dinner party. I was invited." "The Riddle family? Isn't the family that Nicole is from?" Martin's eyes widened, and he looked not too happy. "Why didn't you tell me earlier so I could go with you?" He had long wanted to see what Nicole looked like, and yet he missed such a wonderful opportunity. Sebastian looked at his son with an innocent look. "I thought you disliked going to such parties, saying that the food was terrible, everyone there had an axe to grind, and it was boring. I did ask you to go with me a few times, but you turned it down. I thought." Martin listened to what he said and scratched his head with chagrin. It seems to be true. He was in no mood to eat. As soon as he put down the cutlery in his hand, he received a phone call. Sebastian glanced at it and showed that it was Michael. He quietly withdrew his gaze. He never interfered in his son's career. Martin was a successful doctor, whose medical skills were well known through San Giotto. This was what Sebastian was most proud of. The corner of his mouth curled up in a subtle smile at the thought of this. He saw Martin's face turn serious, and he did not want to disturb him from answering the phone. "Who?" As the person on the other end of the phone said something, Martin got an impatient look on his face. "You know I will never accept patients like him. Go find Joyce, she'll certainly be happy to accept him." Martin then hung up at once. Sebastian looked at his son's angry expression and sighed silently. "Who makes you angry again?" Martin scratched his head irritably and said with annoyance, "They asked me to be Mr. Rogers' senior surgeon. But I don't want to have anything to do with those wealthy people. They are full of themselves, expect too much, and don't follow doctors' instructions. Worse still, they blame doctors for not curing them when problems arise because of their attitude. It is annoying." Sebastian looked at his son and nodded in agreement. "I totally agree." Martin did not expect that his father would approve of him instead of scolding him for lack of a sense of responsibility or anything like that. "Dad, are you all right?" Sebastian looked at his son's face and smiled instead of getting angry. "Since the last time you told me what Solomon did to you, I made up my mind. I will be more circumspect and will not arbitrarily criticize you." Sebastian felt terrible at the thought of him hurting his son's feelings previously. Martin looked into his father's sincere eyes and felt a little embarrassed. He touched the back of his head and muttered softly, "At least you know." Then he got up and walked toward his room. He said nothing, but his steps were apparently brisk. Sebastian looked at him from behind, his expression gradually turning gentle. At an airport in Macrunia, Nicole calmly put on a baseball cap as she and Carl got off the plane. Carl did the same. Their movement was quick, unlike someone who had just gotten off a 7 or 8 hour flight. The airport was packed, but Nicole could sense someone staring at them. She then quickly spotted from the corner of her eye a few fearsome men in the crowd behind her. "Are your whereabouts exposed?" Nicole asked Carl with a frown. Carl was talking on the radio with a miniature headset in his ear when Nicole asked. He was stunned and blurted, "That's impossible." Even his parents did not know about where he was going. His job was only to bring Nicole from Hustuaberg, and in order to make the trip discreet, he had taken an ordinary plane. No way his whereabouts could be exposed. Nicole saw the confident look in his eyes and nodded. "We've got company. 3 and 5 o'clock. Split," she quickly said, and then dashed in the other direction. Carl reacted just as fast. The two of them had been working together for many years and had a tacit understanding. Before those people trailing them could react, Nicole and Carl had vanished into the crowd within seconds. The leader of those people was infuriated and gave a slap to one of his men behind him. "What are you all waiting for? They have noticed us. Give chase." Nicole and Carl moved so quickly that by the time a dozen men split into 2 groups and went looking for them, Nicole and Carl were already nowhere to be seen. The group leader had now calmed down, took out his radio, and whispered to the person on the other end, "Boss, they were quick and got away. We didn't manage to catch them." The person on the other end of the radio seemed to have said something, and the man's face turned pale. He answered respectfully and then beckoned his men behind him. "Call it off." Nicole and Carl got into a low-key black SUV waiting at Gate C almost simultaneously. Carl whistled softly and said, "Nicole, you are quicker than last time." Nicole cocked an eyebrow at him and said, "So are you." Carl could not reach this speed last time. It seemed that the previous mission not only almost put him in trouble but also honed his strength. Carl looked at Nicole with eagerness in her eyes. "Shall we have a friendly match again next time?" Nicole shot him a glance and nodded. She was also curious about how much Carl had grown. But thinking about the look of those people just now, Nicole frowned, turned to look at Carl, and asked in a bitter voice, "Is that them?" Carl hesitated with a confused look in his blue eyes. There was no marking or sign on those people's clothes, so he could not tell if they were sent by that family. He honestly shook his head at Nicole and said, "I don't know." Nicole knew he would not lie to her. The fact that they were ambushed as soon as they got off the plane meant that something had gone seriously wrong. She narrowed her eyes and said coldly, "You've definitely been exposed." Needless to say, Carl was well aware of the problem. His expression remained unchanged, but his voice gradually became grave. "I'll find out." Nicole nodded, not wanting to dwell on this issue for too long. She leaned back in the seat and looked at the unique scenery of Macrunia, thinking about something in her mind. It was a long drive. By the time the vehicle stopped, it was late afternoon. Nicole glanced at the massive manor and the familiar black goat skull statue at the entrance, then slowly stepped out of the vehicle. Carl followed suit. The servant at the door saw the two of them and was visibly shocked. He looked at Carl and asked in disbelief, "When did you go out, Carl?" Carl ignored him and walked inside with Nicole. The servant looked suspiciously at Nicole, whom he had never seen before. But since she came with Carl, he did not dare to say anything and let her in. Nicole looked at the magnificent building as usual, the darker paint only adding to its majestic vibe and did not overshadow its beauty. When the sunset fell on this manor, people would be amazed by the sense of history that came with time. This was a heritage that only ancient buildings possessed. Carl and Nicole walked side by side. The news that Carl had brought a girl home immediately spread throughout the manor. It was still not nightfall yet, but the hall was already brightly lit. People were neatly sitting on both sides of a long dining table, and in the head seat sat a senior man. He was draped in a black nightgown and seemingly could not keep his eyes open. A woman next to the senior man complained, saying, "Why hasn't Keynes come back? Doesn't he know the family is facing some problems lately? It's so hard to gather everyone for a meal together nowadays." Another man next to her chided the woman. "Shut up, Mary. Keynes is the only child of our eldest brother, the heir of our family." This man looked serious, and he spoke what was on his mind and meant his words. He thought Mary was not qualified to say that about Keynes. Behind him, yet another man with an uncomely face slowly said, "Mary has a point. Is Keynes going out to play again during such a bad time? He has always been so willful. Eba, stop defending him just because he is the heir. The heir is replaceable, isn't it?" They occupied the top 3 seats besides the head seat, and the rest of the people dared not say anything upon hearing what they said. These 3 people were the direct line of descendants of the Terman family, and the rest, who were just indirect descendants, had no say at the dining table. When the senior man sitting in the head seat heard what Simon, his younger brother, said, a light flashed in his eyes, and he squinted. He looked at the uncomely man next to him and said disapprovingly, "Simon, you have crossed the line." Simon shot an indifferent look at him, but when his eyes collided with the eyes of the man sitting in the head seat, he gasped. "Just shut up, would you?" Elijah Terman said languidly, looking at his younger siblings, especially Simon, who was looking defiantly at Eba. "Elijah." Simon did not seem to back down. But strangely, Elijah did not actually scold him, but he still felt a chill traveling up his spine. Mary had long since stopped talking. At this time, she looked at Elijah and quickly lowered her head. "Elijah, you said you'd solve our problems," she said eagerly, but did not dare to raise her head to look Elijah in the eyes. The rest of the people also looked at Elijah eagerly. Thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed this story, please like and share so others can see it too. Also hit the subscription button and notification bell so you can be notified on our next release. Thank you for your support. God bless you.